42 years on this bench have taught me that the word immune is one of the most misunderstood words that will ever be spoken inside a courtroom. And the morning a woman named Elena Voss walked through my doors and said it to my face like it was a magic spell rather than a legal concept, I understood immediately that this case was going to become a lesson for a great many people watching, not just for her, because privilege has a way of teaching a person that consequences are something that happen to other people, and Elena Voss had clearly been taught that lesson her entire adult life, ever since she married a man named Damon Voss, a career diplomat attached for the past 6 years to a mid-sized consulate in this city, a man whose actual job, stripped of its titles and its motorcades, was something closer to a mid-level trade attaché than the ambassador-level power his wife apparently believed came bundled with the marriage certificate. And I want to walk through exactly what happened before I tell you what I said to her, because the facts of this case matter enormously to understanding why the word she used that morning turned out to be the single worst word she could have chosen. The collision itself happened on a Tuesday evening in March, at the intersection of 5th and Larkin, where a 26-year-old bicycle delivery courier named Mateo Reyes was stopped at a red light with his bike balanced against his hip, waiting the way he had waited at that same light probably 1,000 times before, delivering food orders across the city to pay his way through night classes at the community college, working the late shift because the tips were better after dark and because his mother, raising 3 children alone after his father passed, needed every dollar he could bring home, and it was in that ordinary moment, waiting at a red light doing absolutely nothing wrong, that Elena Voss's silver sedan drifted through the intersection at nearly 40 miles an hour, running the red light without slowing, and struck Mateo Reyes and his bicycle with enough force to throw him across the crosswalk and into a parked delivery van, breaking his collarbone, fracturing 2 ribs, and rupturing his spleen in a way that required emergency surgery that same night to save his life. And I want you to sit with that image for a moment. A young man delivering food to pay for his education, obeying every single rule of the road, struck down by a driver who did not, because everything that happened afterward in my courtroom only makes sense once you understand exactly how far Elena Voss traveled from that intersection before anyone managed to stop her, which was 4 blocks, 4 full blocks driven at high speed with a shattered windshield and a crumpled front bumper, before a patrol officer finally boxed her vehicle in outside a parking garage. And when that officer approached her window, according to his sworn incident report, the very first words out of her mouth, before he had asked her a single question, before he even knew who she was, were, "I have diplomatic immunity, you cannot touch me." And I want to be honest with you that when I first read that line in the file, I assumed it was going to be one of those unfortunate but ultimately straightforward cases where a genuinely immune diplomatic spouse had, in fact, broken the law. And the courts would have to work through the delicate diplomatic channels that exist for exactly that circumstance, formal notes to her husband's government, a request for waiver, the kind of careful international choreography that happens more often than the public realizes. But the deeper my clerk and I dug into the actual paperwork behind Elena Voss's claim, the clearer it became that this was not that case at all, because diplomatic immunity, contrary to what television and a great many wealthy defendants seem to believe, is not a blanket shield that simply exists because a person is married to someone with a fancy title. It is a specific, narrowly defined legal status granted under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, extended to accredited diplomatic agents and, in many but not all cases, to their immediate family members, but that extension depends entirely on the family member being formally listed and accredited through the State Department's Office of Foreign Missions with a valid, current diplomatic identification card issued specifically to them. And when Priya Chand, the assistant district attorney assigned to this case, subpoenaed the State Department's accreditation records, what came back was something Elena Voss clearly never expected anyone to check, because her diplomatic spousal accreditation had lapsed 11 months earlier, not due to any oversight by the consulate, but because Elena and Damon Voss had been formally separated for just over a year, a fact confirmed by Damon Voss himself in a sworn statement submitted to the court, in which he stated plainly that he had notified the consulate of the separation in writing, as required, and that Elena's diplomatic status, tied entirely to her position as his accredited spouse, had been terminated at that time in full compliance with standard consular procedure, meaning that on the night she struck Mateo Reyes with her car, Elena Voss was, under the law, nothing more than an ordinary private citizen driving on an expired diplomatic vehicle registration that should have been surrendered 11 months prior. And I confess that when I first learned this detail, I felt something click into place that explained an enormous amount about the woman who eventually stood before me, Because a person who has lost the very status she is still loudly invoking is not simply confused about the law. She is a person clinging to the last vestige of a life and an identity that has already quietly slipped away from her, and clinging to it in a way that was about to cause a great deal more harm before this was over. The hearing itself began on a Thursday morning, and I want to describe Elena Voss exactly as she appeared, because it tells you everything about the version of events she believed she was walking into. She arrived in a tailored cream suit, sunglasses pushed up into hair that had clearly been styled that morning by a professional rather than by her own hands, flanked by an attorney who specialized, according to his own firm's website, in international and diplomatic law, a man named Charles Ashford who carried himself with the practiced confidence of someone who has spent a career getting powerful people out of rooms like mine before consequences could catch up with them. And Elena Voss herself did not look at Mateo Reyes even once as she crossed the courtroom. Though he was seated in the gallery in a wheelchair, his collarbone still healing, a thin white scar visible along his hairline from the surgery, his mother seated beside him with her hand resting protectively on his shoulder the entire morning. And when I called the case and asked Elena Voss how she wished to proceed, her attorney rose immediately and stated that his client would not be entering a plea at this time because, in his words, this court lacks jurisdiction over a diplomatic agent's household, and I remember looking up at that phrase and asking him directly whether he was formally asserting diplomatic immunity on his client's behalf, and he said yes, unequivocally on the record, and I told him that I appreciated his clarity, because it was about to make the rest of this hearing considerably shorter than he expected. I asked Priya Chand to present the State Department accreditation records into evidence first, before we discussed a single detail of the collision itself, because I wanted the entire foundation of the defense's argument tested before anything else happened in that room, and the document, official State Department letterhead, plainly showed Elena Voss's diplomatic spousal accreditation terminated 11 months prior, cross-referenced against Damon Voss's own written separation notice filed with the consulate on the exact date the accreditation lapsed, and I watched Charles Ashford's expression shift as that document was read into the record. The particular shift I have learned to recognize after 4 decades on this bench, the shift of an attorney realizing in real time that the ground beneath his argument has already given way and he simply has not been told yet by his own client. I turned to Elena Voss directly and asked her whether she was aware that her diplomatic accreditation had been terminated 11 months earlier, and she said, with what I can only describe as genuine, unrehearsed shock, that no one had informed her of any such thing, and I believed her, which made what happened next considerably more layered than a simple case of a woman lying to a judge, because Damon Voss, still seated in the gallery that morning, having voluntarily appeared to give testimony, stood when I asked him directly whether his wife had been notified, and said quietly that he had informed her by letter at the time of their separation, a letter he had, in fact, brought a copy of that day, one which plainly stated that her diplomatic status, her vehicle registration, and all associated privileges would be terminated effective the date of their formal separation. And when I asked Elena Voss whether she recalled receiving that letter, her composure, which had been immaculate since she walked through the doors that morning, finally cracked, and she said, in a voice considerably smaller than the one she had used with the arresting officer 4 blocks from the collision, that she had received the letter, and had chosen not to read it fully because she said, and I am quoting her directly from the record, she did not want it to be true, and I want to pause on that sentence because I think it explains more about this entire case than any legal document could. Elena Voss had spent 6 years building an identity around a status, a title, a version of herself that came with motorcades and immunity, and the particular kind of untouchability that a diplomatic household provides. And when that marriage quietly ended, she chose, consciously, to keep living inside the version of her life where none of that had changed, driving a vehicle still registered under diplomatic plates she had been instructed to surrender, invoking a status she had been formally told, in writing, no longer applied to her. And I told her plainly from the bench that willful blindness to a legal notice does not preserve a status that has already been terminated, that ignorance chosen rather than genuine is not a defense this court can recognize, and that whatever grief or denial she had been carrying about the end of her marriage did not transfer onto Mateo Reyes, a young man who did nothing that evening except wait at a red light. We then turned to the collision itself, and the evidence there was, frankly, not close. Traffic camera footage from the intersection showed Elena Voss's vehicle entering the crosswalk without any visible braking at all. Toxicology reports taken at the scene showed a blood alcohol level nearly twice the legal limit, and the 4 blocks she traveled after striking Mateo Reyes, rather than stopping immediately as any driver is legally required to do, were captured almost entirely on a combination of traffic and storefront cameras, showing a vehicle with a shattered windshield weaving through evening traffic at speeds well above the posted limit before finally being boxed in by the responding officer. I asked Elena Voss directly why she did not stop immediately after the collision, and her answer, delivered without her attorney's permission and over his visible objection, was that she panicked and that some instinct in her told her that if she could simply get somewhere with diplomatic significance, the consulate building itself was roughly 6 blocks from the collision site. None of what had just happened would actually count. A belief I want to note plainly for anyone watching this is not how the law works anywhere in this country. Diplomatic immunity, even when it genuinely applies to a person, does not function as a physical safe zone a vehicle can drive toward. It is a legal status invoked through proper diplomatic and judicial channels, not a finish line reachable by outrunning a police officer. Mateo Reyes gave testimony that morning that I do not believe anyone in that courtroom will forget easily. He described waking up in a hospital bed 3 days after the surgery that saved his life, having lost that entire span of time to a medically induced coma doctors used to manage the internal bleeding. He described the collarbone that still would not let him lift his younger sister onto his shoulders the way he used to every evening when he got home from his shift. He described missing 11 weeks of both his delivery work and his night classes, falling behind in a program he had been 3 semesters from completing, and having to explain to his mother, who had already lost a husband, why her son had nearly been lost too, over a red light he had done nothing wrong at. His mother, when given the opportunity to address the court, said something I wrote down word for word because I wanted it preserved exactly as she said it. She said that she had spent every night since the accident lying awake doing the math on how close her family had come to losing everything they had left. And that no title, no letter after anyone's name, no motorcade or embassy building, gave a single human being the right to treat a red light, and the life of the young man waiting at it, as something optional. When it came time for my ruling, I addressed Elena Voss directly and told her that I was rejecting the assertion of diplomatic immunity in its entirety, on the clear and uncontested finding that her accreditation had been formally terminated 11 months prior to the collision, that this court therefore had full jurisdiction over every charge against her, and that even setting aside the immunity question entirely, the underlying conduct, driving while intoxicated at nearly twice the legal limit, running a red light at high speed, striking a pedestrian, and fleeing the scene rather than stopping to render aid, represented one of the more serious combinations of reckless conduct I had personally presided over in several years on this bench. I sentenced Elena Voss to 18 months in the county correctional facility, with no portion of that sentence suspended, ordered full restitution covering every medical expense, every week of lost income, and the cost of the semester of night classes Mateo Reyes would now need to retake, ordered her driver's license permanently revoked in this state, and ordered mandatory substance abuse treatment to begin immediately upon her release. And I told her, before the bailiff stepped forward, that the word she had used to the arresting officer on the night of the collision, immune, was not simply legally incorrect in her specific case. It represented a mindset this court had a responsibility to correct plainly and publicly, because a great many people walk through the doors of courtrooms across this country still believing that status, title, or proximity to power makes them exempt from the basic obligations every other person on the road is required to meet. And every single time that belief goes unchallenged, it costs someone like Mateo Reyes a collarbone, a semester, a coma, and 11 weeks of a mother's sleepless nights. Charles Ashford attempted, briefly, to argue for a stay pending appeal, citing his client's, in his words, complicated diplomatic household circumstances, and I told him plainly that a household his own client had already testified she knew, on some level, no longer existed, was not a circumstance this court would treat as a mitigating factor. It was, if anything, the very definition of the willful blindness that had placed Mateo Reyes in a hospital bed for 11 days. Damon Voss approached Mateo Reyes and his mother after the hearing concluded, and though it was not part of the formal record, my clerk relayed to me afterward that he had personally guaranteed, in writing, that any restitution amount beyond what Elena's own assets could cover would be paid in full by him directly. A gesture that did not erase what had happened but which Mateo's mother later told the court, in a brief follow-up letter I received nearly 4 months afterward, had meant more to her son's recovery than she expected any part of this case to mean, because it told him, in her words, that at least one person connected to that night understood exactly how much had nearly been taken from her family, Mateo Reyes returned to his night classes the following semester, graduated 8 months later than originally planned, and sent my chambers a short note through Priya Chen's office thanking the court, not for the sentence itself, he wrote, but for saying out loud in a room full of people that the red light he was waiting at mattered exactly as much as any embassy gate in this city. And I think about that sentence often, because I believe it captures something true about what this entire case was really about. Beneath the diplomatic paperwork and the accreditation records and the blood alcohol readings, it was about a woman who mistook a title for a shield long after the title itself had quietly expired, and a young man who simply wanted to get home safely to help his mother make dinner, and in the end, the law did not care how many motorcades Elena Voss had once ridden in. It cared only about the facts in front of it: an expired status, a shattered windshield, a red light, and a young man who had done everything right and nearly paid for someone else's delusion with his life. And that, more than any ruling I handed down that day, is the lesson I hope this case leaves behind: that immunity, real or imagined, was never meant to be a word wealthy or powerful people whisper to police officers as a way of making consequences disappear. It is a narrow, carefully defined legal status that exists for very specific diplomatic purposes, and the moment it is invoked by someone standing outside its actual boundaries, the word does not protect them at all. It simply reveals, plainly and publicly, exactly how far they had let themselves believe the rules of ordinary life no longer applied to them.